Oh, good evening everyone, and thank you for coming along to the sequel to our series on World War I. And tonight we're going to be looking at some of the events that are happening in the Middle East today and how they relate to Bible prophecy and the unfolding development of Bible prophecy in our own times. So this picture we saw last time in our last session, and we felt that this was a defining moment in the Middle East history, because for the first time in nearly 2,000 years, Europeans were in control of the Middle East. Muslim lands were invaded, as it were, by a European army, and no longer would Palestine be under Arab control. So we also saw that Bible prophecy in Ezekiel chapter 38 predicted all of the combatants of World War I would be involved in another world war, a world war converging in the Middle East. Because the Middle East today is the powder keg that the Balkans was in World War I. And it's going to be the cause, or the spark, in fact more than the spark, that causes another world war. And we also saw that there's another prophecy in the Bible that was directly fulfilled in World War I, in Daniel chapter 11. And both of these prophecies speak about the same things. We'll just do a little bit of a recap on Daniel chapter 11. So both of these prophecies are in the latter years or the latter days in Ezekiel 38, or as it says in Daniel chapter 11 verse 40, the time of the end. Because that's the time when Israel is regathered back as a nation in the land once more, and we'll see that in a moment. And the invading force in both of these chapters comes from the north, and it is noted as a strong military power. And this power enters the glorious land in Daniel chapter 11, which is a name for the land of Israel. In Ezekiel 38 it says the mountains of Israel. And we see that this invader in both cases covers the land. It's an overwhelming invasion. They are both allied with Libya and Ethiopia. And in both cases, the invader is destroyed by God. So this is not a prophecy or an event that has happened in the past. This is something that is yet to occur, because the culmination of the invasion in both of these chapters is that they will be destroyed by God, and that there will be a kingdom established on the earth by God. So this war will truly be the war that ends all wars, unlike World War I, which more or less was the cause of a whole lot of other wars. So Daniel chapter 11, that we saw in our last session, was about a king of the north and the king of the south. And in particular, we find in Daniel chapter 10 verse 14 at the beginning of this prophecy that the purpose of this prophecy was to let Daniel know what would befall his people Israel in the latter days. Well, that's actually the same time period as Daniel chapter 11 and Ezekiel chapter 38, the time of the end, the latter days. And that's the time when Israel is regathered into the land. But the prophecy begins in a time just after the empire of Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great was a Greek, and his empire extended right across to this territory and down into Egypt. And after his death, he had no heir, and so the empire was divided between his four generals. And the two prominent generals was the Seleucids in the area of Syria and Iraq and Iran, and the Ptolemies in Egypt. And these two empires had a succession of kings and rulers, and they were always at war with each other. And because the prophecy was written from the standpoint of the Jews, because it was about what was going to befall the people of Israel, the Seleucid Empire was called the King of the North because they were north of Israel, and the Ptolemaic Empire was called the King of the South because they were to the south. And Daniel chapter 11 in quite vivid detail, goes through the history of the rivalry between these two empires in ancient times. Until another king comes along, the Romans, who are based in Constantinople because the capital was moved to Constantinople. And ultimately, this king took over all of this territory, and there was no more king of the north, no more king of the south, no more Seleucid or Ptolemaic empires. The Roman Empire took over. Now, the significance of the fact that this is the latter days, or the latter times, is the fact that when Israel is gathered back into their land once more, because the Romans, by the way, dispersed the Jews. There was a rebellion in AD 70, and around that time period, the Jews were scattered out of the land into Europe and Asia and Africa. And there was no more nation of Israel in the land. In fact, there hadn't been for 2,000 years until just recently. And what God tells us in Joel chapter 3, verse 1 and 2, that at those days and in that time, when I shall bring again the captivity of Judah and Jerusalem, that's the time that I'm going to gather all nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat. And the valley of Jehoshaphat is just outside Jerusalem. And what God is saying is this is the latter days. This is the latter times. When Israel is back into the land, that's when things are going to happen. That's when this invasion by Ezekiel chapter 38 is going to take place, when the invasion in the latter part of Daniel chapter 11 is going to take place. Now, after the Romans, of course, there were the Muslims, the Saracens and the like, and then the Turks. And the Turks held all of this area for quite a few hundred years. And in fact, it was only up in World War I that they finally lost control of the land of Israel, and things progressed for the captivity of Judah and Jerusalem to be brought back, as it were. So in Daniel chapter 11, verse 40, the prophecy begins a new section, and it says, at the time of the end. So this is the latter days, this is the last times. And at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him. Well, of course, you see, there was no Ptolemaic empire in these times at the end. So who is the king of the south? And what the Bible is telling us is that there's going to be a latter-day representation of the king of the south. There's going to be another power that occupies this territory that acts as the king of the south, and that was Britain. In the late 1800s, Britain took over Egypt and Sudan and the Suez Canal from the Ottoman Empire. And Britain became the king of the south in the terms of this prophecy, the latter-day representation of the king of the south. And in World War I, the king of the south pushed at him, at the Turks, at the Ottoman Empire, by pushing up into Palestine and through the area of Mesopotamia, and pushing the Ottoman Turks right back to the borders that they now occupy. That was the king of the south pushing at him. And of course, they then controlled the former territories of the Ottoman Empire for a time. But then there's the king of the north will also come against him, this king here. And what we want to have a look at tonight is this king of the north for a little bit, because this king of the north is going to attack Constantinople, Turkey today, and it's also going to invade the land of Israel. It says he shall enter into the countries. And it also says specifically that he would have a final battle outside Jerusalem. So after having invaded Egypt and the land of Israel, he ends up at Jerusalem. It says in verse 44 that tidings out of the east and out of the north, when he's in Egypt, shall trouble him, so he'll go up to the north and to the east with great fury to destroy. and utterly to make away many. So his intent obviously is violent. And he shall plant the tents of his palace between the seas, that's the Mediterranean Sea and the Dead Sea, in the glorious holy mountain, which of course is none other than Jerusalem, Mount Zion. And he shall come to his end, and none shall help him, because God will there intervene in this last battle at Jerusalem. We want to look at how current events today are leading to these events and how the world is being developed for this. So let's just go back to the end of World War I. At the end of World War I, the British and the French basically carved up the old territory of the Ottoman Empire between them. So to the north we have French area, to the south we have the British area, and in particular in Palestine and Jordan, the British had a mandate. And of course the United Nations was involved with all of this, and they were never going to keep these territories, but they did have them for some time. And finally, out of the ashes, as it were, of the Ottoman Empire arose a whole lot of new, modern nations that had never existed before, or if they had, in the case of Iran, that had always existed, that wasn't part of the Ottoman Empire. They certainly had not been independent for hundreds of years. And as we saw in our last session, the vacuum left by the Ottoman Empire created a great political upheaval. It's a vacuum that we're still feeling the reverberations of today. So the Ottoman Empire was a repressive and dominant empire that forced its control on all of this area. And all of these countries had no self-determination. They were part of the Ottoman Empire, and they were firmly under the control of the Ottoman Empire. Well, when they gained their independence, these nations actually had autocratic government. And the borders of these countries were autocratic, were just simply made up, as it were, by the Western powers. They were unilaterally drawn by Britain and France in particular, without any regard to the ethnic peoples that were in that border. So if we were to look at this map of the political borders of these countries, and then have a look at a map of the ethnic breakdown of the peoples in the region, we see that they just do not correspond. This is a map prepared by NATO showing the ethnic and religious breakdown of the Middle East. Take, for example, the Kurds. Their country, as it were, or that people is divided up between at least 4 different countries. And we know of the Kurds because they have been involved in trying to gain their own independence, but they probably will never get it. And you see that all of these countries, the political borders do not correspond to the national and ethnic groups or the religious groups. We've got the Sunnis and the Shias, as well as other tribal peoples in this area. And so when you have ethnic groups that straddle political borders, and when you have countries that are made up of more than one ethnic group, when you get the autocratic control of that country gone, then you have upheaval and civil war and strife. And that is exactly what happened just not long ago in the Arab Spring. Here we have the Arab countries of North Africa and the Middle East. In Libya, the government was overthrown, and in Tunisia. In Egypt and Yemen, we had governmental change because of the riots and the protests that took place. There were minor protests in Jordan, but there were still protests there, which was important, as well as Saudi Arabia and Sudan and Mauritania. The fact, though, is that there were protests in the first place. Even in a place like Saudi Arabia, which, you know, the monarchy there has a fairly firm control on things. And there were widespread protests in the likes of Algeria and Iraq. In Syria, we had an armed rebellion that still is going on today. There is still civil war raging in Syria, and Lebanon is also divided. We're familiar with the factions in Lebanon because of the war that has existed there in the past. So these countries that were once autocratically ruled and were relatively stable, well, now the whole Middle East is in turmoil. It's all being mixed up together. It's all got strife. There's still civil war raging in Syria. There's trouble in Egypt. The army had to move in and take over, as it has a number of other times before. Libya is controlled by factions and warlords, as is Somalia and the like. There's trouble all through the Middle East. It's in turmoil and there is great upheaval. And so when this sort of incidents are carrying on, this is the time when things can change dramatically. And we don't know exactly what changes will take place, but there is a great state of flux in the Middle East right now. This is the powder keg, the cauldron, that could easily bring the world into war. In fact, the Bible says it will. And of course, Iraq has had sectarian violence ever since the Americans have invaded. And they've left the place in much the same state of tatters as they entered it. One interesting group that has arisen in Iraq and Syria, in actual fact they grew in Syria, is ISIS, or the IS. This is an extreme terrorist group that surprised everybody by taking over great swathes of territory, as we'll see in a minute. These want to establish their own caliphate across Syria and Iraq. And they have gone about crucifying people and massacres and atrocities and the like. And here we have a video of one of them beheading James Foley, a journalist. In fact, they've done a few of those of foreigners. They're trying to make a point. What was particularly disturbing to the Western powers was that this executioner had a British accent. And one of the greatest fears of the European nations today is that there are so many Muslims that have emigrated to Europe and Britain. And there are hundreds of them that have gone to Syria to fight. And the concern is that they come back and they will then be terrorists back in Europe again. That they've been radicalised even more by their experience in Syria in particular. Now this group, ISIS, has surprised everybody by its great sweep of territory that it's occupied here in pink. So much so that it even threatens Baghdad. And so much so that even the Americans are bombing them. There's even talk now of an international coalition, not to have troops on the ground, but an international coalition to counter this surprise ISIS move. Now, ISIS, by the way, are Sunnis. And one of the reasons that they have gained so much ground in northern Iraq is because the Sunnis in the north have been very discontented with the Shia government in the south. And just remember that Iraq had been dominated by a Sunni-led Saddam Hussein, a very authoritarian government for quite a long time. And when he was removed, the Shias felt quite liberated, and then they went to extremes in repressing the Sunnis. And now the Sunnis are coming back and having their turn. So now we've got a lot of instability in Iraq, a lot of instability in Syria. Here's a map of the ambitions that ISIS has. They want to establish their own caliphate all through Syria and Iraq, based on the ethnic groupings of their Sunnis and their tribes. Of course, the Americans still have quite a heavy military presence in the area, and they intend to, and they have bombed them, and they intend to bomb them. What is interesting is that this area is the area of the Seleucid Empire. Iraq and Syria and Iran are the old king of the north. And it's interesting how that the area of the King of the North has become one of the divides in the Middle East. And of course what we're showing here is what is styled the Shia crescent. In fact, King Abdullah of Jordan styled the Shia crescent because Iran has benefited from the United States intervention in Afghanistan and Iraq. It's actually weakened the balance of power in the region, and so Iran has now risen in strength and in might, and Iran is influencing events in Iraq and in Syria and in Lebanon. So much so that it is known as the Shia crescent, because that is the sphere of influence of Iran. But of course, this is exactly the area where ISIS has arisen, and ISIS are Sunni, they're not Shia. And we would believe, although we really don't know, we don't want to make any predictions here, but it would indicate, indications are that the Sunnis under ISIS will not last. Iran is an emerging great power. It's not going to have Sunnis taking control of its backyard, of its sphere of influence, because it wants this area. It wants the access to the Mediterranean Sea through Syria and Lebanon. And it's a great supporter of Hezbollah, of Assad, and of the Shia government in Iraq. And it's even provided troops, revolutionary guards, to fight ISIS. ISIS has made enemies of everybody. Not even Al-Qaeda supports ISIS. ISIS is actually too extreme for Al-Qaeda. So the chances of ISIS lasting any long time is not great. However, what that does, it throws the whole region into even more instability. So our expectation is that this area, the Shias, and it is dominated largely by Shias, while it's not the Shias are not the majority in Syria and Lebanon, they are a sizable minority there and have had power there before, because Assad is Shia, that this area will be influenced by Russia, because Russia has supported Iran in its nuclear standoff with the United States. Russia has opposed sanctions on Iran. Russia has opposed United States interference in Iraq and has supported Assad, and has opposed attempts by the West to depose Assad, and has supported Hezbollah. And so while we are yet to see what might develop, that is what would logically follow. And of course, this is the area of the King of the North. And when Russia has a controlling influence in this area in particular, that's when Russia becomes the King of the North. Now, of course, just a slight aside, we saw before that Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish are in opposition to this King of the North. And Sheba and Dedan being Saudi Arabia, and Tarshish being Great Britain, and the young lions being the Commonwealth countries and the United States, they have a very strong military presence in Saudi Arabia and the Arabian Peninsula, and they like that because they are afraid of Iran. They've always been afraid of Iran, ever since the Ayatollah Khomeini took over. And they've been afraid of Iran even when Iraq was at war with Iran. But now that Iraq has been weakened, they are even more afraid. And so they want to have Western military presence. And of course, the West wants a military presence there as well. But those are not the only issues, or even the main issues going on in the Middle East. Because the underlying real issue in the Middle East is the issue of Palestine. This is what Osama bin Laden, who is not a Palestinian, said after the September 11 bombings, which we're coming up to the anniversary shortly. He said, "What America is tasting now is something insignificant compared to what we have tasted for scores of years. Our nation," and what he means by that is the Islamic world, not just Saudi Arabia or any particular nation that was unilaterally drawn up by the Western powers, has been tasting this humiliation and this degradation for more than 80 years, ever since the British entered Palestine and took over Muslim territory from an Ottoman Turkish Muslim power. Not that they liked the Ottoman Empire, but at least they were Muslim. In these days, Israeli tanks infest Palestine, in Jenin, Ramallah, Rafah, Beit Jala. And he says, I swear by God who has elevated the skies without pillars, neither America nor the people who live in it will dream of security before we live it in Palestine. And the whole issue is the fact that there is a state of Israel in the middle of a Muslim world, and that the West is occupying or has influence and military presence in Muslim countries, and that is greatly resented, especially their invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, we saw in Ezekiel chapter 38 that the merchants of Tarshish, which we believe to be Great Britain, and the young lions thereof, and of course here we have Britain depicted in a World War I enlistment poster as a lion, and the Commonwealth as young lions, that they defend Israel when the northern invasion happens in the future in Ezekiel chapter 38. And they act as the protectors and the guardians of Israel in Ezekiel chapter 38. But even more than that, in Isaiah chapter 60, they are instrumental in the return of Israel back to their land after 2,000 years. So in Isaiah chapter 60, the prophecy concerning Tarshish and their role in bringing Israel back, this is a prophecy directed to Israel. In verse 4 it says, Lift up thine eyes round about, they come to thee, your sons shall come from far. And then just skipping down to verse 9, surely the isles shall wait for me, and the ships of Tarshish first, to bring your sons from afar. And Britain, with its mandate in World War I, and with the Balfour Declaration, paved the way, in fact was instrumental in having a state of Israel formed back in that land once more. It never would have happened had it not been for the fact that the Ottoman Empire was forced back out of that land. So here are some key dates in the restoration of Israel. In 1917, it should say there, General Allenby took control of Palestine, the British forces. The Balfour Declaration was issued, which we'll look at in a moment. After that, the State of Israel was declared by David Ben-Gurion. And then in 1967, Israel took control of Jerusalem in the Six-Day War. And what's really important to note is that the Jews that have returned are of the tribe of Judah. This is not the lost 10 tribes as such. This is particularly the tribe of Judah. And it's also the control of Jerusalem. This is the time that God said before in Joel chapter 3, when the captivity of Judah and Jerusalem shall be returned. Now here's the Balfour Declaration, issued in 1917 by the British. Now of course the British at this time were in a desperate battle against the Axis allies. And the Jews saw an opportunity, particularly in the Palestine campaign, of being able to support the British and being able to establish a nation in their own land again. And the British issued this Balfour Declaration. In the yellow it says, His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object. So they made promises to the Jews that they would have a land, a nation in the land once more when the Ottomans were gone. Of course, the British also made promises to the Arabs. Remember Lawrence of Arabia, the Arabs were also very instrumental in helping the British drive back the Ottoman Empire. And one of the agreements that was made was known as the McMahon-Hussein Agreement, the Hashemite Arabs in Jordan. And that agreement stated that land that cannot be said to be purely Arab was excluded from the agreement. Of course, the idea there being if there was a Jewish population, then that would be dealt with differently. But of course, things don't remain static like that. And this agreement is subject to a reasonable amount of interpretation and misunderstanding. Needless to say, the history, just a very brief history of things. In 1947, the United Nations voted to form two states in Palestine as it was known then. In the purple was the state of Israel, and in the green, the state of Palestine. Well, that never eventuated. As soon as Israel declared its independence, 6 or 7 Arab armies invaded, and quite remarkably, Israel held their ground. They were all expected to be decimated by the overwhelming odds they faced. But the borders looked like this after the War of Independence in 1949, as it's called. And so the West Bank, as we have it today, and the Gaza Strip. And these are the borders that most countries in the world would expect to be the borders of two states, of Palestine and of Israel in the future. But of course, as we know, negotiations and peace talks have hardly even got past the starting stage, let alone coming up with any solutions. So of course, in the Six-Day War, Israel actually occupied the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and the Sinai and the Golan. It's since given back the Sinai Peninsula, it's withdrawn from the Gaza Strip, and it's given a reasonable amount of autonomy to the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. But there is still no peace settlement between the Palestinians and the Israelis. This is an article from the BBC from 2010, just a few years ago. And it said, the Middle East is full of talk of war. Not today, tomorrow, or perhaps even next year, but the horizon is dark. And people who have to live with the Middle East's grim collection of smouldering problems are finding it hard to look ahead with anything other than foreboding. And that was before the Arab Spring and the instability in other Arab countries. The article goes on to say and highlights probably one of the main issues in the that stopped peace from being able to be achieved. What is even more serious is that it is centred on the future of Jerusalem, and Jerusalem is the issue that they just cannot agree on, which is about the single most emotive issue in the entire Middle East, because Jerusalem is a holy place for all the main religions of the world. And it is clear that the Americans want Israel to freeze building for Jews in those parts of the holy city that Israel occupied and annexed in 1967. And the background behind all of that is, you see, here's the border there, and Israel to this side, Palestine as it is to this side. And in blue here we have a whole lot of Jewish settlements in the dark blue. And in the light blue are Palestinian urban areas. And Israel is expanding its settlements in the Middle East, in the West Bank, particularly in the area of Jerusalem. And that is one of the great sources of friction and contention, and one of the great barriers to any peace in the Middle East. The Obama administration has concluded that it will be impossible to negotiate peace while Israel continues to settle its people on occupied land. Israel's claim that that city is its sovereign capital is not accepted by its allies, because Israel has said that Jerusalem is its capital, so have the Palestinians. The president of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, pulled out of peace talks after the Israelis announced a big building project at the Ramat Shlomo settlement in occupied East Jerusalem, somewhere in this area there. And the US Vice President, Joe Biden, was in Jerusalem at the time to get the talks going. Great timing for him. Embarrassed and angry, he condemned Israel's plan. So even America, particularly under the Obama administration, is not very happy with how Israel is behaving. You see, America is Israel's greatest supporter and ally, and yet they even upset them. Now, apart from the rights and wrongs of all of this, we're interested in Bible prophecy, not the political issues. So we're not going to really comment too much on that. But of course, in Gaza, we have Hamas. Hamas took Gaza from the Palestinian Authority some time ago, and they are much more militant. And in the recent Gaza conflict, which came to a head because of rockets being launched from Gaza, the Israelis, of course, responded in kind. Now, this just shows you the extent to which the Gazans can fire rockets into Israel. Now, this is produced by the Israel Defence Force. What we're particularly interested in, though, is the fact that these rockets have quite a range. These rockets, by the way, are supplied by none other than the Iranians, a rising power in the Middle East. And somehow they've managed to be able to smuggle hundreds of or tens of thousands of these rockets, because hundreds of them are being fired every day. So Israel is not safe like it used to be. The rockets from Gaza are a real threat. Now, of course, Israel deployed the Iron Dome defence system and shot down a lot of the missiles that threatened urban areas. A lot of the other missiles landed harmlessly. The other issue in the Gaza conflict were the tunnels built by the Palestinians to infiltrate Israeli territory and to launch terrorist attacks. While there were tunnels at the crossings for smuggling purposes, these tunnels were to infiltrate Israeli territory. And so when Israel launched a ground offensive to the north and to the south, they uncovered about 32 tunnels, or about 33 tunnels, and they destroyed them. Of course, the Palestinians tell us that they didn't get them all, and they probably didn't. In fact, some of these tunnels were used to ambush Israeli soldiers during the conflict. And then there was the accusation of the number of civilian casualties. This is one of the real emotive issues of this war, and people feel very strongly about it, and understandably so. And of course the defence is, well, the Palestinians were using them as human shields. And we'll never really know, because the media are so biased one way or the other. We would never really know exactly what the facts are. But of course, in Palestine, it's the most densely populated area almost in the world. It'd be almost impossible for any military strike on the area to be pinpointedly precise on just exactly where the terrorists were, or the Hamas were. Besides all that, this is just a visual comparison of the death toll in this last Gazan conflict. Most of these deaths are civilians. These figures are really inconclusive, but they give us a pretty good indication that, of course, the Palestinian death toll was much higher than that of the Israelis, because the Israelis have a greater military capability and were able to defend themselves better and attack better. This is a graph just showing since 2000 the death toll on both sides from the conflict in Gaza. So here we have all the various operations that have taken place over the last 4 years: Operation Defensive Shield, Operation Summer Rains, Operation Cast Lead, and just recently Operation Pillar of Cloud. And all of these conflicts, the particular conflicts, cause great loss of life, particularly on the Palestinian side. And this has caused, in Western countries in particular, and Muslim countries, anger. There's a lot of emotion about the fact that there are a lot of Palestinians being killed. No one really seems to worry too much about the actual facts because no one even really knows them anyway. But the emotion is there, and that's what the point is. And this is important in terms of Bible prophecy because it is shaping the world's opinion about Israel. And nations that were perhaps once pro-Israel are now neutral at best. A lot of people are very anti-Israel because they see them as being oppressive on the Palestinians. There are moves to boycott Israel. Don't buy or support companies that are either owned by Israel or Jewish firms or support Israel in any way. In fact, there's a new anti-Zionism emerging. In fact, it's been around for quite a long time. It's not anti-Semitism as in the sense of anti-Jewish. It is anti-Zionist as in against the state of Israel. And that sentiment is growing in the world, and that's a sign of the times as far as we're concerned, because we are looking for the fact that the world is going to become anti-Zionist against Israel. This is in 2013, 2014, this is a survey taken, and I'm not quite, I think it's taken in Europe, and the comments about whether a country was mainly positive or mainly negative on its role in the world. And at the top we have the likes of Germany that is seen quite positively. Down the bottom we have Iran and Pakistan and North Korea, which understandably is seen quite negatively. Oh, and Israel is just fourth from the bottom. That's how people see Israel. This is a graph of anti-Zionist feeling this time last year versus, this time of the year, just after the Gaza offensive, to the same time last year in blue. So in blue, this time last year, in Europe, that was the number of, the proportion of those who felt anti-Zionist. Look at the difference this year. And in the United States, Canada, South America, Oceania, etc. But in particular, Europe, significantly, which has a history of anti-Semitism anyway. And the United Nations is anti-Zionist. Rightly or wrongly, it is anti-Zionist. This is from a book called The United Nations War Against Israel by David Harsini in 2002. And he says, in the United Nations General Assembly, 429 anti-Israel resolutions were passed from 1967 to 1988. Israel was condemned 321 times, Arab nations not once. Obviously this writer is pro-Israeli, but the point is that the United Nations is not in support of Israel. The most repugnant of these anti-Semitic resolutions came in November 1975 when the UN ruled that Zionism was a form of racism. And while that has since been rescinded by the United Nations, the sentiment amongst a lot of people is that Zionism is racism, that Israel was a mistake, that Israel just should not be allowed to do what it does, that it is oppressing the Palestinian peoples. The United Nations UN Commission on Human Rights, for the last 40 years, almost 30% of country-specific resolutions and 15% of the Commission's time has been directed against Israel. During its annual 6-week session in 2002, the Commission spent half its time on Israel, more than it spent on all other countries in the world combined, including the likes of North Korea and so forth, and Iran. So there is definitely a bias in the world against Israel. Let's just have another look at the jigsaw puzzle, and let's go back to Ezekiel chapter 38. And what is really important, if we read this carefully, is that while this invader overflows the whole country, the attack is specifically directed against the mountains of Israel and against the Israelites that dwell in the middle of the land. And the mountains of Israel run down through where the West Bank is. And that's also a Bible term for the middle of the land. So while there is an invasion of this whole country, in particular, the objective of the invasion is the West Bank. Now, why would that be? Well, we've already seen that the West Bank, there are lots of Jewish settlements, and that's seen as a great problem. None of Israel's allies support their settlement in the West Bank. But we're told in Ezekiel chapter 38 that Israel would be settled in the West Bank. And we know from that Israel is not going to withdraw from the West Bank, because Ezekiel chapter 38 says that Israel is in the West Bank when the invasion occurs. It says in verse 12, the desolate places that are now inhabited, because Israel has done a lot to convert arid, unproductive land to fertile, productive land. And upon the people that are gathered out of the nations, which have gotten cattle and goods, that dwell in the middle of the land. And it's not just the West Bank in particular. It's also that area where Jerusalem is. And Jerusalem is the area that no one can find a resolution to. No one. There has been there's been no development whatsoever. They haven't even come close to coming to a resolution on Jerusalem between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And that's exactly what the Bible said. In Zechariah chapter 12, verse 2 and 3, God says, behold, I will make Jerusalem a cup of trembling unto all people round about when they shall be in the siege, both against Jerusalem, against Judah and Jerusalem. There we have Judah and Jerusalem again, the captivity that has been returned. And in that day will I make Jerusalem a burdensome stone for all people. All that burden themselves with it shall be cut in pieces, though all the people of the earth be gathered together against it. And you see, Jerusalem has been an issue that has been thrashed about by all nations in the United Nations, and it's a big international issue. Now, we don't know the specific details, but what it looks like is that there is a coalition of nations headed by Russia, involving Europe and the Middle East, who come down to settle the West Bank issue once and for all, because their objective is Jerusalem and the mountains of Israel in the middle of the land, the area where the West Bank is. And Zechariah continues and talks about this invasion. It says, for I will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city shall be taken, and the houses rifled, and the women ravaged, and half the city shall go forth into captivity, and the residue of the people shall not be cut off from the city. You see, the world will believe probably that Israel was a mistake, that Israel can't be allowed to continue perhaps. We don't know the detail. But what is certain is that this attack is anti-Zionist. If we just have a look at a few passages to illustrate that. In Ezekiel chapter 38 verse 8, it is against the mountains of Israel. Not just on the mountains of Israel, but against the mountains of Israel. In Ezekiel 38 verse 12, the invader will turn his hand upon the people. The attack is against my people of Israel in Ezekiel 38 verse 16, because they're in the land. In Joel chapter 3 verse 2, it is against my people and my heritage Israel. In Zechariah 14 verse 2, it is against Jerusalem. It is an anti-Zionist attack. And you see, the world's solution to this problem is a two-state solution. And from a human point of view, that might seem fair and reasonable. But the problem is, God's already promised it. And God is the owner of the land. That's not something that really comes up in the political discussions. And God has said he doesn't want the land split up. He is going to give a just solution to the Arabs, and we'll see that in just a moment. But in Joel chapter 3, which is another chapter that talks about this invasion by all nations into Israel, he says, I will also gather all nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat, just outside Jerusalem, and I will enter into judgment with them there on account of my people, my heritage Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations. They have also divided up my land. You see, it's God's land. That's what God says. He says it's my land, and they've tried to divide it up between two states. That's not what God wants. You see, God's promised it to the Jews, to Israel. He made that promise to Abraham, who, by the way, is the forefather of both the Jews and the Arabs. And because of Abraham's standing with God, and because the Arabs through Ishmael are also descended from Abraham, God made special promises about Ishmael that the Arabs would inherit all of this land here to the east of Israel, and that this land would be fertile, not the arid desert that it is today. And that's what's going to be achieved when the Lord Jesus Christ returns to the earth, because only He can arbitrate successfully between the Arabs and the Jews, between Israel and the nations. It is He who will bring peace. He will have the wisdom and the justice and the integrity to be able to do what no one can do today or has ever been able to do. But what's really important for us in this time is that these promises that God has made are not just for the Jews. These promises are not just for the physical blood descendants of Abraham. These promises are international. And these promises are the gospel that we can benefit from if we come into a relationship with God. In Galatians chapter 3, verse 26 to 29, so this is the New Testament talking about these ancient promises in the Old Testament. And the Apostle Paul here is speaking to non-Jews. He says, for if you are all the children of God by faith in Christ Jesus. You see, faith is the important thing. As many of you as have been baptized into Christ have put on Christ, because we become associated with Him by being baptized, if we have faith. And look at this, there is neither Jew nor Greek. It doesn't matter what nationality you are. You don't have to be an Israeli. There is neither bond nor free. There is no social restriction. There is neither male nor female. There is nothing to do with what gender you are, for ye are all one in Christ Jesus. And if you are Christ's, then are you Abraham's descendants and heirs according to the promise. You see, Abraham was given promises not just for himself and his descendants, literally, but for all those who are his descendants by faith. And that's what we can become, friends. We can inherit those promises through Abraham by faith and by being identified with the Lord Jesus Christ. And if we are, then with the Lord Jesus Christ, when He comes, we will be amongst those who rule with Him over a world in justice and peace and equity. And we will be able to rid the world of corruption and of exploitation and war and violence and crime. Because the Bible hope is as in Revelation chapter 11 verse 15, is that the kingdoms of this world are become the kingdoms of our Lord and of His Christ, and He shall reign forever and ever. And while there will be another war involving all nations, this is the war that will end all wars and will usher in an everlasting age of peace.